Imagine you were told you couldn't wear red on Tuesdays at work. Good afternoon. You're watching 33 Facts. Here we tell amazing stories, scientific misconceptions, and unexplainable facts. Get comfortable. We're starting now. First ridiculous rule: no humming or whistling while you work. This wasn't just some random workplace preference. In the early 1900s, factory owners across America implemented strict silence policies. The Ford Motor Company famously banned any form of musical expression on the assembly line. Workers caught humming a tune could face immediate dismissal. Management claimed that singing or whistling disrupted concentration and slowed down production. But the real reason ran deeper. Factory owners believed that if workers were happy enough to hum, they weren't taking their jobs seriously enough. One Ford supervisor in Detroit kept a notebook where he recorded every instance of unauthorized whistling. By 1923, over 200 workers had been fired for this violation alone. Former employees recalled the eerie silence of workshops where hundreds of people worked without making a single sound beyond the clatter of machinery. But wait, second absurd regulation: women had to wear skirts of a specific length, measured daily. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, corporate America became obsessed with female dress codes. At IBM headquarters in New York, female employees lined up each morning for skirt inspections. Supervisors used wooden rulers to measure the distance from knee to hemline. The required length was exactly 2 inches below the kneecap. If a woman's skirt measured incorrectly, she was sent home to change, losing a day's pay. This wasn't limited to one company. Major corporations including General Electric, AT&T, and numerous insurance firms enforced similar policies. One woman who worked at a Philadelphia insurance company in 1962 remembered standing in line with dozens of other women, feeling humiliated as male managers approached with rulers. Now here's where it gets interesting. Third bizarre rule: employees couldn't bring lunch from home. During the Great Depression and continuing into the 1940s, certain American companies banned outside food entirely. The Pullman Company enforced this policy at their Chicago facility. Workers had to purchase meals from the company cafeteria at inflated prices. If someone was caught with a homemade sandwich, they faced suspension. The reality was pure profit. A simple lunch that might cost 15 cents to make at home sold for 50 cents or more at company facilities. Workers who couldn't afford cafeteria prices often went hungry. In 1937, workers at a Pullman facility in Illinois staged a 3-day walkout specifically over the lunch policy. And there's more. Fourth insane policy: bathroom breaks required supervisor approval and were timed. Textile mills in North Carolina and Georgia during the 1920s implemented bathroom ticket systems. Each worker received 3 tickets per day, each allowing a 5-minute bathroom visit. To use the restroom, you had to raise your hand, wait for supervisor acknowledgement, hand over a ticket, and then be timed. If you exceeded 5 minutes, you lost pay. Supervisors stood outside bathroom doors with stopwatches, literally timing each person. Some developed urinary tract infections and other health problems from holding their bladders. Union organizers used these bathroom policies as rallying points, arguing that workers were being treated worse than prisoners. Let's move forward. Fifth outrageous rule: employees had to smile at all times when visible to the public. Department stores took this to an extreme level. Macy's in New York implemented smile monitors in the 1930s. Supervisors whose sole job was observing employee facial expressions. The company published a manual with diagrams showing the correct smile width and tooth visibility. Workers were required to maintain their smiles even during difficult customer interactions, personal emergencies, or when they felt ill. Some stores photographed employees at random intervals throughout the day, reviewing the images later to ensure compliance. Psychologists later studied these policies and found they contributed to depression, anxiety, and emotional burnout among retail workers. Here's something that might surprise you. Sixth ludicrous regulation: no marriages between co-workers, with both people fired if discovered. Many corporations maintained strict anti-fraternization rules. If 2 workers fell in love and married, both faced immediate dismissal. Companies conducted investigations when they suspected workplace romances. Some hired private detectives to follow employees after hours. In one documented case from 1948, a Pittsburgh steel company fired a couple who had worked there for a combined 23 years after someone reported seeing them together at a restaurant. Women almost always suffered more severe consequences than men. These policies created a climate of secrecy and fear. Countless couples hid their relationships for years, living separate lives at work while being married at home. If you enjoy our videos about amazing facts, myths, and bold truth-telling, support us with a like and write the number 1 in the comments. If they're not working for you, put a 0. This way we'll understand what interests you and make the episodes even better. But there's an important detail. 7th absurd requirement. Employees couldn't speak their native language if it wasn't English. In the early 1900s, factories and mines implemented English-only policies with harsh penalties. At coal mines in Pennsylvania and West Virginia, workers who spoke Polish, Italian, Greek, or other languages faced fines and beatings. Company guards patrolled work areas listening for foreign languages. Management claimed this promoted safety, but the real goal was cultural suppression and preventing workers from organizing along ethnic lines. Children grew up never hearing their parents' original languages. Entire cultural traditions were lost because families were too afraid to maintain them. Now pay attention. 8th ridiculous policy, mandatory morning calisthenics and exercise routines. In the 1920s and 30s, several American companies adopted Japanese-style group exercise programs. Workers had to arrive 30 minutes before their official start time for synchronized physical activities. No additional pay was provided. At the Western Electric factory in Illinois, hundreds of employees stood in formation performing jumping jacks and stretching exercises while supervisors watched. Workers who couldn't perform the exercises due to age or physical limitations faced discrimination and were often relegated to lower paying positions. And here's what really raises questions. 9th insane rule. Employees had to maintain specific body weights, with monthly weigh-ins. From the 1950s through the 1980s, airlines required stewardesses to weigh in monthly. Each woman had a maximum allowable weight based on her height. Exceeding this weight by even 1 pound could result in suspension without pay. Going 2 pounds over meant termination. Women developed eating disorders, used dangerous diet pills, and engaged in extreme behaviors to meet the standards. The humiliation of public weigh-ins, often conducted in front of male supervisors, caused lasting psychological damage. Let's examine the next point. 10th outrageous regulation. Employees couldn't wear glasses because they looked unprofessional. During the 1950s and 60s, many companies refused to hire women who wore glasses. The reasoning was purely aesthetic. Management believed glasses made women look less attractive. Women with poor vision faced an impossible choice: wear expensive contact lenses or simply go through their workday unable to see clearly. At advertising agencies in New York and Los Angeles, the no glasses policy was explicit. Receptionist job postings specified no glasses along with height, weight, and appearance requirements. Here comes an unexpected turn. 11th bizarre requirement. Workers had to stand throughout entire shifts, even when sitting wouldn't affect productivity. Department stores, shops, and banks prohibited employees from sitting under any circumstances during business hours. Cashiers, sales clerks, and tellers stood for 8 to 10 hours daily, even during slow periods with no customers. Management claimed that standing employees appeared more attentive and ready to serve. Medical evidence showing the health consequences of prolonged standing, varicose veins, back problems, foot issues, was ignored. Pregnant women were expected to stand their full shifts until they went on unpaid maternity leave. Now for something truly fascinating. 12th absurd policy. Employees couldn't have visible body hair for women or insufficient facial hair for men. In the 1950s and 60s, many companies required women to have completely hairless arms and legs visible in the workplace. Some corporations conducted visual inspections, sending women home if supervisors detected arm or leg hair. Meanwhile, sales positions often mandated that men maintain mustaches or beards because clean-shaven faces were considered too youthful or untrustworthy. The racial implications were significant. These standards were based on white European beauty norms and discriminated against people whose natural hair growth patterns differed. And this is where it gets truly strange. 13th ludicrous rule, mandatory personality testing with wrong answers resulting in termination. In the 1950s and 60s, American corporations became obsessed with psychological testing. Companies required employees to complete extensive personality questionnaires asking about personal beliefs, family relationships, sexual attitudes, and political opinions. Workers who scored too high on independence were considered unmanageable. Those who scored too low were deemed unambitious. In some cases, honest answers about mental health struggles or family problems led to termination. Workers learned to game the system, providing answers they thought management wanted rather than truthful responses. But there's another version, 14th insane regulation. Employees had to participate in company social events on their own time without compensation. Throughout the mid-20th century, many American corporations organized picnics, parties, and sporting events. Workers were required to attend despite these events occurring on weekends or evenings. Failure to participate was noted in employee files and affected promotion opportunities. Many company events required employees to pay for their own meals, transportation, or activity fees. Workers spent their precious free time at these functions unable to refuse. Those with family obligations, second jobs, or simply a desire for work-life boundaries had no acceptable excuse. Let's go deeper now. 15th ridiculous requirement. Workers couldn't discuss their salaries with colleagues, with immediate firing for violations. This policy served one purpose: allowing companies to underpay certain employees while preventing them from discovering wage inequities. Employment contracts explicitly forbade salary discussions. The policy particularly harmed women and minorities who were systematically paid less than white male colleagues for identical work. But without being able to compare salaries, they had no way to prove discrimination. Companies actively fostered a culture of secrecy around compensation. Workers who violated the rule were swiftly fired, serving as warnings to others. Time for the next detail. 16th outrageous policy. Female employees had to resign upon marriage. This wasn't uncommon, it was standard practice at many American companies through the 1960s. Banks, insurance companies, airlines, and school systems maintained explicit marriage bars. Women who married had to immediately resign or be terminated. The reasoning provided was that married women would soon become pregnant and leave anyway. School districts were particularly rigid. Female teachers who married during the school year were immediately dismissed, disrupting students' education. These marriage bars only ended after the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited sex discrimination in employment. Now here's what's rarely discussed. 17th bizarre rule. Employees had to purchase company products to keep their jobs. Car manufacturers required assembly line workers to buy the vehicles they built. Clothing companies mandated that retail employees purchase and wear the current season's fashions. These weren't employee discounts. They were forced purchases at full or slightly reduced prices. A car factory worker making modest wages might be forced to purchase a vehicle costing months of salary. The financial burden was enormous. Workers had no choice. Refusing to purchase meant termination. The practice created cycles of debt, with workers borrowing money to make mandatory purchases. And the story continues. 18th insane regulation. Workers had to provide their own tools and equipment despite being employees. Companies hired workers but refused to provide the tools necessary to do the job. A mechanic might be hired by an auto shop but required to purchase thousands of dollars worth of wrenches, sockets, and diagnostic equipment. Apprentices and young workers faced particular hardship. They had to invest in extensive tool collections before earning significant wages. Many went into debt buying equipment needed to keep jobs that barely paid living wages. The policy also created barriers to employment. Unemployed workers who couldn't afford tool purchases couldn't access jobs that required them. Moving forward, 19th absurd requirement. Employees couldn't have any visible tattoos or piercings beyond single earlobe piercings for women. From the 1950s through the early 2000s, most American corporations maintained strict rules against visible body modification. Workers with tattoos had to keep them completely covered regardless of temperature or discomfort. Women could have one hole per earlobe. Men couldn't have any piercings at all. The policy reflected cultural attitudes associating body modification with criminality or rebellion. Military veterans with service tattoos, people with cultural or religious markings, and others faced discrimination. But here's a crucial point. 20th ludicrous policy: mandatory lie detector tests for employees without cause. Polygraph examinations became a corporate obsession in the 1960s and 70s. Companies subjected workers to regular polygraph tests supposedly to prevent theft. Simply being employed was sufficient reason to be interrogated while hooked to a machine. Workers were asked invasive questions about drug use, political beliefs, and private behaviors. Results were pseudo-scientific at best. Polygraphs detect nervousness, not deception. Anxious workers who feared losing their jobs showed stress responses that were interpreted as lies. Federal legislation in 1988 finally restricted most private sector polygraph use. Here's another layer to consider. 21st ridiculous rule: workers couldn't bring reading material even during breaks. Factory and retail environments implemented this policy widely. Workers on lunch breaks couldn't read newspapers, magazines, or books. The actual purpose was controlling workers' thoughts and preventing exposure to labor organizing literature. During the early 1900s, companies feared that workers who read might encounter socialist ideas or union propaganda. By banning all reading material, they could prevent such exposure. Employees sitting in break rooms during unpaid lunch periods were forbidden from reading. Security guards confiscated newspapers and magazines. And now for something even more surprising. 22nd outrageous regulation. Employees had to live in company housing at inflated rents. Mining companies, textile mills, and manufacturing firms built housing near their facilities and required workers to rent from them. The rents charged often consumed half or more of workers' wages. Employment contracts required residence in company housing. Those who tried to live elsewhere were fired. Companies paid wages, then immediately collected much of that money back through rent. Workers could never save enough to leave because their earnings disappeared into housing costs. Some companies paid workers in scrip, company currency only valid at company establishments. This system trapped workers indefinitely. Let's examine this more carefully. 23rd bizarre requirement: workers couldn't vote for certain political candidates or parties. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, factory owners openly threatened workers with termination if they voted for candidates who supported labor rights. Before secret ballots became standard, companies could monitor how workers voted. Supervisors stood at polling places watching which ballots workers selected. Even after secret ballots were implemented, companies found ways to pressure workers politically. Mandatory meetings before elections featured speeches about which candidates would protect jobs and which would destroy them. Now watch what happens next. 24th absurd policy: employees couldn't marry people from certain ethnic, religious, or racial backgrounds. Throughout much of American history, companies maintained policies about who workers could marry. Some corporations explicitly forbade interracial marriages. Workers who married someone of a different race faced termination. Religious restrictions were also common. Some businesses refused to employ people in interfaith marriages. These policies were often unwritten but firmly enforced through social pressure and selective discipline. Workers understood the expectations without needing explicit statements. This changes everything. 25th insane rule: workers had to provide urine samples for testing without individualized suspicion. Drug testing emerged in the 1980s and spread rapidly. Companies began requiring urine samples from all employees, regardless of job performance or any indication of drug use. Employees had to urinate under observation to prevent sample tampering. This humiliating process involved another person watching bodily functions. Workers were treated as presumptively guilty and required to prove their innocence through chemical testing. The test detected drug use during off-work hours, extending company control beyond the workplace. And there's yet another angle. 26th ludicrous regulation: employees couldn't have natural hairstyles for black workers. From the early 20th century onward, predominantly white companies enforced grooming standards based on white European hair textures. Black workers with natural hair, braids, locks, or other traditional styles faced discrimination and termination. The policies claimed to enforce professional appearance but were rooted in racism. Black workers had to chemically straighten their hair or wear wigs. The psychological damage of being told your natural appearance is unacceptable in professional contexts was severe. Here's what we need to understand. 27th outrageous policy: Workers couldn't take sick leave without a doctor's note, even for single-day illnesses. Workers who called in sick for one day had to visit a doctor and obtain written documentation proving illness. Doctor visits cost money. Workers had to pay for appointments to prove they were too sick to work. The policy forced workers to choose between attending work while contagious or losing a day's pay, plus spending money on unnecessary medical visits. This spread illness throughout workplaces. Sick workers came to work because they couldn't afford the doctor's note requirement. But that's not the whole story. 28th, ridiculous requirement. Employees had to work unpaid overtime or face termination. Wage theft through unpaid overtime affected millions. Some companies required workers to arrive early or stay late without compensation. Retail workers had to come in before stores opened to prepare displays and stay after closing to clean, all without pay. Other companies manipulated time clocks. Workers were required to clock out but continue working. Supervisors would send workers to clock out at their scheduled end time, then require them to return and work several more hours unpaid. Now for the final points. 29th bizarre rule. Workers couldn't have visible disabilities or use assistive devices. Before disability rights legislation, companies routinely refused to hire anyone with visible disabilities. Wheelchair users, people with prosthetics, those with visible differences, all were deemed unemployable. The rationale was that disabled workers would upset customers or be unable to perform duties. Workers who became disabled while employed faced termination. An injury resulting in need for a wheelchair meant losing your job. The passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990 began changing these practices. 30th, absurd policy. Employees had to sign non-compete agreements preventing them from working in their industry if they left. These restrictive covenants trapped workers in bad jobs. Low-wage workers at sandwich shops signed contracts barring them from working at any other sandwich shop for years. Workers who wanted to leave abusive or low-paying positions couldn't, because doing so meant being unable to work in their field. The geographic scope was often absurdly broad. A worker in Boston might be prohibited from working anywhere in the United States. 31st, insane regulation. Workers couldn't discuss working conditions or organize collectively. Companies implemented rules explicitly prohibiting workers from discussing wages, hours, or conditions with each other. Employees who talked about organizing unions were fired. Company spies reported conversations to management. Workers learned to never speak openly about their jobs. Many workers didn't know their legal rights. Companies deliberately kept workers ignorant of protections. Even when workers won legal cases, the process took years during which they remained unemployed. 32nd, ludicrous policy. Employees had to pay for mistakes, breakage, or shortfalls out of their own wages. Retail cashiers whose drawers were short at the end of shifts had to make up the difference from their own money. Restaurant servers had to pay for dine and dash customers who left without paying their bills. Factory workers who broke tools or damaged products had deductions taken from paychecks. The policy placed all business risk on the lowest paid workers. This was generally illegal under wage and hour laws, but enforcement was weak. 33rd outrageous rule. Workers couldn't leave employment without giving extended notice periods or face financial penalties. Employment contracts required workers to provide notice periods of 1 month, 3 months, or even 6 months before leaving. Failure to give required notice triggered financial penalties. Workers had to pay thousands of dollars to leave their jobs. Companies could terminate workers immediately without notice, but workers were bound by restrictive notice requirements. This power imbalance was deliberate. Companies wanted the flexibility to dismiss workers instantly while preventing workers from doing the same. Workers stuck in hostile environments, abusive situations, or jobs causing health problems couldn't leave without financial ruin. The policy particularly affected workers who had accepted relocation assistance or signing bonuses. Companies designed these benefits as golden handcuffs. Taking a $15,000 relocation package meant being locked into the job for 2 or 3 years. Leaving early required repaying the full amount immediately. Workers who received professional training as part of employment had to repay training costs if they left too soon. So here's what remains unclear. These 33 ridiculous office rules reveal patterns of control and exploitation that characterized American workplaces across generations. Some policies reflected specific prejudices of their eras: racial discrimination, gender restrictions, ethnic suppression. Others served purely economic purposes, transferring costs and risks onto workers. Many combined both motives. What's certain is that millions of American workers endured conditions that modern audiences would find shocking. Whether current workplace protections adequately prevent similar abuses remains debatable. Labor rights activists argue that many of these practices continue in modified forms today, while others contend that regulations have successfully eliminated the worst excesses. The historical record is clear, but interpretations of its lessons vary widely. The power imbalances that enabled these absurd rules haven't entirely disappeared. Contemporary workers still face challenges around surveillance, appearance standards, mandatory overtime, and restrictions on organizing. Technology has created new forms of workplace control that earlier generations never imagined. The fundamental tension between employer power and worker rights continues evolving, raising questions about what ridiculous rules might seem normal today, but outrageous to future audiences. Understanding this history helps illuminate ongoing struggles for workplace dignity and fair treatment. The enforcement mechanisms for these absurd rules deserve special attention. Companies didn't just create policies and hope for compliance. They built elaborate systems to catch violators. Surveillance was constant and invasive. Floor supervisors prowled workplaces looking for infractions. Some companies employed professional snitches whose sole job was reporting rule violations by fellow workers. These informants were paid bonuses for each worker they reported, creating financial incentives for betrayal. The atmosphere of mutual suspicion poisoned workplace relationships. Co-workers couldn't trust each other because anyone might be reporting back to management. Some companies installed peepholes in bathrooms and break rooms to monitor workers during their few moments away from direct supervision. Others used early forms of time motion studies not just to measure productivity, but to identify workers who deviated from prescribed movements and behaviors. The surveillance extended beyond work hours in company towns where housing, stores, and social spaces were all company-controlled. Workers lived under total observation with no refuge from management's watchful eyes. This panopticon-like system meant workers could never relax or be themselves. The psychological toll of constant monitoring was immense, contributing to stress, anxiety, and a sense of powerlessness that permeated every aspect of workers' lives. The generational trauma caused by these workplace policies extended far beyond the workers who directly experienced them. Children who grew up in families governed by these rules internalized lessons about power, submission, and self-worth that shaped their entire lives. They watched parents humiliated by arbitrary rules and learned that authority figures could demand absolute obedience without justification. They saw mothers fired for getting married or gaining weight and absorbed messages about women's disposability. They witnessed fathers beaten for speaking their native language and learned that cultural identity was something to hide and suppress. These childhood experiences created patterns of thinking and behaving that persisted across generations. Adult children of workers who endured these policies often struggled with self-advocacy, believing that challenging unfair treatment was futile or dangerous. Some became excessively compliant in their own careers, unable to set boundaries or demand fair treatment. Others went the opposite direction, becoming distrustful of all authority and unable to function in structured environments. The intergenerational impact of workplace trauma remains understudied, but is visible in communities where these exploitative practices were concentrated. Families in former mill towns, mining communities, and industrial centers still carry the psychological scars of their ancestors' workplace experiences, affecting everything from educational attainment to economic mobility to physical and mental health outcomes across multiple generations. The resistance to these ridiculous rules, though often overlooked in corporate histories, was continuous and creative. Workers found countless ways to subvert unjust policies, even when open rebellion meant termination. They developed coded language to discuss wages and organize despite prohibition. They created informal support networks to help colleagues fired for minor infractions. Women shared strategies for concealing pregnancies or marriages to keep their jobs longer. Workers smuggled in homemade lunches disguised as personal items when outside food was banned. They warned each other about which supervisors were conducting skirt measurements or bathroom time checks. Some sabotaged the very systems designed to control them, breaking time clocks that monitored their movements, providing false information during personality tests, or coordinating mass bathroom breaks to overwhelm ticket systems. These small acts of defiance rarely appear in official records, but were crucial to workers maintaining dignity and humanity in dehumanizing conditions. The courage required to resist, even slightly when discovery meant losing your livelihood, was immense. Yet workers resisted anyway, proving that the human spirit refuses complete subjugation. Their resistance laid groundwork for eventual labor reforms and workplace protections. Every ridiculous rule workers challenged and every unjust policy they exposed helped build the movements that eventually secured better conditions. This legacy of resistance reminds us that workplace rights weren't granted generously by enlightened employers. They were fought for and won by workers who refused to accept the unacceptable. That's it for today's episode. These 33 ridiculous office rules show how far American workplaces have come, but also remind us to stay vigilant. Power imbalances still exist, and new forms of control constantly emerge. If you found this interesting, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. Leave your thoughts in the comments. What shocked you most? Thanks for watching. See you next time on 33 Facts.